The crackling message over the radio broke the quiet inside station Hypo in Pearl Harbor on May 27, 1942. Commander Joseph Rockford leaned over the decrypted text, his expression hardening as the truth became clear. The Japanese were advancing toward Midway, confident that their strategy would ensure victory. Hundreds of miles away, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the battleship Yamato, certain that his multi-layered plan would crush the U.S. Pacific Fleet. As the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, he had devised an offensive that seemed impossible to defeat. A feint toward the Aleutian Islands was designed to lure American forces north, while his primary fleet would seize Midway and eliminate the remaining U.S. naval resistance. However, Yamamoto's central flaw had already compromised everything. He believed only two American aircraft carriers and Hornet remained in the Pacific. Japanese intelligence had concluded that the Yorktown had suffered such severe damage during the Coral Sea battle that it would remain docked for months. But at Station Hypo, Joseph Rockford's codebreakers had accomplished what had never been done before. They had cracked the Japanese JN-25 naval code, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz insight into Japanese movements almost as if he could read their thoughts. Historical records from the Naval History and Heritage Command describe how Rockford's group uncovered Midway as the target using a ruse about a fake water crisis. On that same day, May 27th, the battered Yorktown limped back into Pearl Harbor, its decks damaged and its hull marked by recent combat. Engineers initially believed it would take 3 months to restore her, but Admiral Nimitz refused to wait. In a remarkable push that would become legend, teams of workers toiled day and night for 3 straight days, welding and repairing non-stop to ready the ship for action. Meanwhile, Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, in charge of the carrier group aboard the Akagi, reviewed intelligence with growing certainty. His force composed of Akagi Kaga, Soryo, and Hiryuas, the most formidable concentration of naval air power ever seen. These were the very ships that had struck Pearl Harbor and were now poised to finish the job. But warning signs were present for those willing to see them. The Japanese had incomplete aerial reconnaissance, and their submarine patrols failed to locate the approaching American fleet. Most damaging, Yamamoto's plan had scattered Japanese forces over a wide area, making coordination nearly impossible, when trouble inevitably surfaced. By the early hours of June 3, 1942, Yamamoto's operation was underway. A northern unit attacked Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians, but the anticipated American reaction did not occur. Instead of chasing the distraction, U.S. carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and a barely repaired Yorktown moved silently into position northeast of Midway. Japanese leaders had entirely misunderstood the American situation. They had misjudged enemy capabilities and were unaware of how thoroughly the Americans had penetrated their plans. As night fell on June 3rd, both sides braced for conflict, though only one truly understood what the next day would bring. In the pre-dawn stillness of June 4th, the ocean was calm, masking the storm about to erupt. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral reviewed final orders with the careful attention that had earned him a reputation as Japan's top carrier commander. His fleet glided through the waves, radio silent, confident that they controlled the seas. At 4:30 a.m., 108 planes lifted off from the Japanese carriers. Their engines roared in unison, creating a rolling wave of sound over the Pacific. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the formation toward Midway, where U.S. defenders stood ready. The Japanese pilots, hardened by 6 months of victories stretching from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean, advanced with total assurance. Yet Nagumo's second key mistake was already unfolding. In line with Japanese strategy, he had kept half his aircraft in reserve, equipped with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes in case enemy ships appeared. Though reasonable, this decision would have disastrous consequences. At 5:53 a.m., American radar operators spotted the incoming strike. Air raid sirens pierced the early light as U.S. planes scrambled skyward. Marine Fighter Squadron 221, flying outdated Brewster Buffaloes, raced toward the threat. The clash that followed was one-sided. 23 American aircraft were lost, for only minor damage to the attackers. But the fierce resistance slowed and disrupted the Japanese plan. Though Tominaga's force inflicted some damage and started fires, they failed to shut down Midway's airfield. At 7 a.m., Tominaga radioed back, stating that another strike was needed. This transmission set off a fatal chain reaction. Believing no enemy fleet was nearby, Nagumo gave the order to rearm his reserve planes for a second land assault. On the hangar decks of the 4 carriers, crews began replacing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs with high explosives, unaware that American patrol aircraft had already discovered their position. At 5:34 that morning, a PBY Catalina had sent a message. Japanese carriers located bearing 320, 180 miles away. Admiral Raymond Spruance, leading Task Force 16 aboard Enterprise, received the report and immediately began launching his planes. He chose speed over precision, a decision that would become typical of American naval tactics in the coming years. By 7 o'clock, both Hornet and Enterprise were sending every bomber and torpedo plane they had toward the Japanese. Simultaneously, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher prepared his strike from Task Force 17, centered on the seemingly out-of-commission Yorktown. The ship Japanese analysts had dismissed was about to make a critical impact. At approximately 7:28, Nagumo was handed another alarming report. A group of 10 ships likely American had been spotted at a bearing of 010, 240 miles out. His fleet was now in danger, and his aircraft were still equipped for bombing land targets. He had to choose: launch immediately with the wrong weapons, or delay and refit for naval combat. He decided to delay. Hangar crews began yet another round of rearming remove, high explosives and reloading torpedoes. The decks were littered with ammunition. Fuel hoses lay sprawled across surfaces. The Japanese carriers had become volatile powder kegs, just waiting for ignition. By this time, the first wave of American attackers was approaching. At 9:20 a.m., they arrived. The scene was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. 4 of the world's mightiest carriers sailing in formation, guarded by layers of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. As Japanese gunners opened fire, the sky exploded with anti-aircraft bursts. The first attacks were devastating for the Americans. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, flew outdated devastators directly into the heart of enemy fire. Their slow speed and lack of maneuverability made them easy prey for Japanese Zero fighters. 14 of 15 planes were destroyed. Only Ensign George Gay survived, watching the fight unfold while floating in the sea. Not a single torpedo found its mark, but the sacrifice had a profound impact. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been drawn to low altitude. Other American torpedo squadrons met similar fates. From Enterprise, Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 planes. From Yorktown, Torpedo Squadron 3 lost 12 of 13. Led by ace pilot Saburo Sakai, Japanese defenders shredded the slow attackers. From his vantage point on the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo felt reassured. The enemy attacks had been repelled with minimal harm, and his aircraft were nearly ready for a powerful counterstrike. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. But destiny had other intentions. At 10:22 a.m., as Japanese fighters refueled and rearmed close to the sea, 37 American dive bombers from the Enterprise arrived overhead. Led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, they had followed a Japanese destroyer that unintentionally guided them straight to the enemy fleet. The Japanese carriers were at their most exposed, with their decks packed with warplanes being refueled and armed. Their formidable Zero fighters, which had earlier decimated the incoming American torpedo bombers, were flying low over the ocean and were in no position to rise in time to intercept the incoming dive bombers. Despite a furious storm of flak, nothing could stop the Americans diving almost vertically toward their targets. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey split his formation. One section headed for the Akagi, the centerpiece of Japan's carrier fleet. Lieutenant Dick Best released a bomb that pierced a deck and detonated inside the hangar, where volatile fuel and armed planes ignited in a tremendous chain explosion. In just a few moments, the once mighty vessel became an inferno. At the same time, the Kaga came under assault from the second American group. Multiple hits turned the carrier into a floating firestorm. Her hangars erupted into chaos as stored bombs and fuel added to the destruction. One of the principal attackers of Pearl Harbor was now succumbing to the very flames she had once unleashed. Not far away, 17 dive bombers from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie located the Soryu-3 precision hits gutted the ship, turning her into a blazing ruin. Her captain, Ryosaku Yanagimoto, rather than face surrender, chose to die aboard his ship. In a span of barely 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers had been critically damaged. The very systems that allowed them to launch massive air raids loaded hangars, open fuel lines, munitions stocked near aircraft, had now made them helpless once struck. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been sailing at some distance and escaped the American onslaught. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, immediately prepared a counter-offensive, though any advantage the Japanese once held had been erased in those catastrophic minutes. Admiral Nagumo, now forced to abandon his burning flagship, watched his entire plan fall apart before his eyes. The Japanese leadership had misinterpreted every warning, and Midway was delivering its verdict without mercy. Thick smoke billowed from the burning ships, climbing into the sky like dark towers. Hiryu, the only carrier still afloat, readied her response. Yamaguchi, famous for his bravery and relentless resolve, refused to accept defeat quietly. At 10:58, he sent 18 dive bombers and 6 fighter escorts aloft in a final bid to strike back. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led this desperate attack, fully aware that his mission was likely a one-way flight. With the rest of the fleet in ruins, these aviators flew with grim clarity. They were the last hope of turning disaster into something less final. Meanwhile, the American ships stayed alert. Their radars picked up the incoming threat, and on board the Yorktown, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher readied his men for the renewed fight. Though believed destroyed by Japanese planners, the Yorktown was still very much alive and about to be tested to her limits. At 12:10, the Japanese bombers arrived. The ship's defenders, 12 Wildcat fighters, soared to meet them in a chaotic, furious aerial melee. Despite their resistance, 7 Japanese planes broke through and began their assault runs. The first bomb tore through the flight deck and exploded among the parked planes, igniting flames. A second struck near the smokestack, jamming the ship's ventilation and filling her with choking smoke. A third hit further damaged the upper deck. Yet Yorktown's crew fought back fiercely. Her damage control teams sprang into action, and within 2 hours, the fires were subdued and flight operations resumed. The ship was moving at full speed once more, with her air wings back in the fight. Admiral Fletcher, seeing his crew's performance, informed the fleet that Yorktown was combat-ready again. But the Hiryu had not made her final move. At 1:30 p.m., Admiral Yamaguchi launched another Wave 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters, led by Lieutenant Toshio. These were the same aircraft models used to devastate Pearl Harbor just half a year earlier. The pilots understood this was their last chance. Hiryu had no more aircraft to spare. This second attack proved far more destructive. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's port side, tearing through the hull and disabling the engine room. The vessel began to lean dangerously, and at 3 p.m., Captain Elliot Buckmaster made the difficult call to abandon ship. Despite their valiant earlier efforts, the damage was too severe. Still, Japan's temporary success could not mask the looming disaster. While Yorktown was left crippled, Enterprise and Hornet remained active and dangerous. 3 of Japan's carriers were smoldering wrecks, and worse still, the aircrews that had taken years to train were now dead or adrift in the ocean. It was a blow Japan's naval aviation could never recover from. Admiral Yamaguchi, understanding the hopelessness, remained aboard his carrier. American search aircraft had already spotted the Hiryu, and the next blow was inevitable. At 3:30 p.m., 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher, found the last Japanese flat top. Her defenses, worn thin from earlier battles, were almost non-existent. 4 bombs hit their mark, turning her deck into a ruin. The Hiryu, the final functioning ship of the Japanese carrier fleet, was mortally wounded. Yamaguchi, standing amid the flames on his command bridge, refused to leave. Like his comrades before him, he chose to perish with his ship, a final act of loyalty to an empire whose strategy had failed him. As the sun dipped below the horizon on June 4th, the Pacific bore witness to a naval disaster of epic proportions. For Japanese carriers, Kagikaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were now either sunk or engulfed in flames. Their battle flags, once symbols of a rising empire, now fluttered in ruin. These same ships that had struck with terrifying power at Pearl Harbor had now become floating memorials to strategic blindness. Far away on the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the unfolding disaster with increasing disbelief. The very man who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor and promised Japan half a year of dominance was now seeing that promise unravel in mere hours. Misguided assessments, flawed strategies, and inaccurate intelligence had brought his bold plan to ruin. The human toll was immense. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and aviators perished. Among them, the Navy's most seasoned and talented pilotsmen, whose experience could never be duplicated. Japan's training programs, already stretched thin, would never produce replacements of equal skill in sufficient time. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu embodied the tragic valor of the Japanese leadership. Refusing to flee his doomed ship, he sang the national anthem as fire consumed the vessel. Admiral Yamaguchi met a similar fate, embodying the rigid sense of honor that blinded Japan's command structure to change and adaptation. Even in victory, the Americans paid a heavy price. Though they had won decisively, the Yorktown was lost after heroic but futile efforts to save her. Brave men had given their lives to shift the momentum of the war. Their sacrifice underscored the grim nature of the battle. Yet the triumph at Midway proved the value of intelligence over brute strength. Commander Joseph Rockford's team at Station Hypo had shown that breaking the enemy's code could be more powerful than building another fleet. Because of that breakthrough, Admiral Nimitz was able to anticipate Japanese moves and turn an expected ambush into a deadly trap. Admiral Raymond Spruance's battlefield decisions marked the rise of a new generation of American leadership. His choice to strike the moment the enemy was found, rather than delay for perfect positioning, defined a boldness that would guide U.S. naval strategy moving forward. The fall of Japan's carriers proved that decisive action would win out over cautious posturing, and Midway's implications would echo long past the final bomb. Japan's ability to launch major offensives in the Pacific had been devastated, pushing the empire onto the back foot, a position from which it would never fully recover. The proposed conquest of Midway was abandoned, along with any realistic hope of creating a fortified line of defense to shield the homeland. From oncoming American assaults, more importantly, the clash signified the turning point in control of the seas, with the United States beginning its rise to naval supremacy. The industrial machine that had once seemed irrelevant during Japan's initial surge now began to surge into dominance. American factories were producing carriers faster than Japan could conceive, and pilot schools in the U.S. were graduating aviators in volumes Japan couldn't begin to equal. Japan's naval leaders had failed to read the situation. They underestimated America's production strength, misjudged its strategic direction, and were caught off guard by flexible and fast American responses. Their adherence to outdated beliefs where courage and training could overcome blinded them to the new reality of warfare. The string of victories that began with Pearl Harbor was now in ruins, buried beneath the wreckage of their most powerful ships. As night fell on June 4th, it was no longer Japan that dictated the pace of war in the Pacific. When the sun rose on June 5th, it shone over an ocean transformed by the destruction of the day before. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the Yamato, struggled to contain the despair spreading across his face. The mastermind behind Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor now stood in the aftermath of a collapsed strategy. The remnants of his carrier fleet drifted in chaos near Midway, and the reports flowing in confirmed an overwhelming failure. Akagi had been evacuated and would be destroyed by her own navy to avoid falling into American hands. What was meant to be the knockout blow to the U.S. Navy had instead crippled Japan's naval air power. The toll was enormous. For carriers, destroyed and with them the skilled aviators that had been honed over years of training. Meanwhile, the American fleet remained largely undamaged. Rather than weakening American strength, the attack had left Japan's military position in tatters. Kaga had already gone under, taking the dream of Japanese maritime superiority with concentrating all carriers in one group, once considered a formidable approach, had proven to be a deadly vulnerability exploited to devastating effect by American bombers. Japan's fixation on attack over defense meant essential measures like fire suppression and anti-aircraft protection were lacking. More tragically, the highly centralized command system gave little room for on-scene commanders to adapt as the tide turned. Soryu went up in flames, visible from miles away. Hiryu, the last remaining carrier, burned uncontrollably and would soon follow the others to the ocean floor. The same admiral who had led the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor now presided over the most crushing naval defeat in Japan's history. The Japanese Navy had relied on elite training and fierce morale, but these were no match for America's vast industrial output and innovation. Japan's strategy, which assumed it could fight a successful defensive war from fortified island chains, was now reduced to defending isolated outposts with no air support. The U.S., once scrambling to hold territory, was now preparing to push forward. Japan's decision to delay aircraft launches in order to rearm cost them everything. Meanwhile, American shipyards were already on pace to produce 24 new carriers by the end of the following year. Breaking Japanese communications had proven just as important as bombs and bullets. The effectiveness of American dive bombers had been decisively demonstrated, and the vulnerability of capital ships to aerial assault was now undeniable. From this point forward, the United States would drive the direction of the war, while Japan was forced into a defensive stance, constantly reacting rather than initiating. The perimeter Japan had hoped would safeguard its empire had become a string of isolated islands waiting to be retaken. The aircraft carrier now stood as the supreme instrument of naval power, and future fleets would be built around this understanding. What began as Japan's attempt to finish the job they started at Pearl Harbor ended as the moment America seized the advantage for good. Yamamoto, who had warned Tokyo that Japan could not sustain a drawn-out war against a nation like the United States, now faced precisely that situation. Intelligence blunders, poor timing, and rigid assumptions had all come together to doom Japan's campaign, and the cost would extend beyond those who made the decisions. It would be paid by the entire empire. Yamamoto's grand plan depended on a decisive blow within half a year. That chance died at Midway. The ability to interpret enemy plans accurately had proven far more valuable than having more ships or planes. That advantage would guide American strategy going forward. Japan's limited shipbuilding capacity, already strained by competing demands, could not hope to replace what had been lost at Midway. The fleet, shattered and leaderless, no longer had the strength to go on the offensive. From now on, the United States would dictate the tempo, with superior production and evolving tactics. The carriers lost in this single engagement were more than ships. They were the foundation of Japan's future in the Pacific, and they could not be rebuilt in time. Japan's expansion phase was over. The empire would now fight a long, costly war to hold what it had gained, and it would do so under increasingly difficult conditions. Along with its ships and aircraft, Japan had lost irreplaceable combat veterans. Seasoned pilots who had trained for years were now gone, and their absence would be felt in every battle to come. In contrast, American pilot schools were producing waves of new aviators, quickly filling gaps left by losses. Japan's leadership had failed to understand the changing nature of war, and Midway handed down a brutal verdict. The fatal decision to reconfigure aircraft for a second strike on Midway, rather than preparing for a naval engagement, left the carriers completely exposed. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor raid, was present on the account. As she was engulfed in flames, he witnessed firsthand the complete collapse of the naval air force he had once commanded. The flyers who had once ruled the skies were now gone killed, captured, or drowning in the sea. Their expertise had vanished. With them, Japan's ability to train replacements was simply not fast or expansive enough to recover. Now, Yamamoto faced a grim truth. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito was speechless upon hearing of the defeat. Across the world in Washington, President Roosevelt recognized the moment as the beginning of a new era for the Allies. What had started as a confident offensive by Japan had ended with its fleet in ruins and its forces on the run. Midway was supposed to create a shield around the home islands, but now that vision lay in pieces. Japan's far-flung troops would have to fight without air support, while the United States began planning a relentless counteroffensive that would drive across the Pacific. The intelligence failures that doomed the Japanese effort were no longer in doubt. The Americans had brought 3 carriers to the battle, not 2, as Japan believed. The Yorktown, thought to be out of service, had returned, fought fiercely, and absorbed severe damage before she finally sank. Most damning, the United States had known of Japan's plan from the outset and turned the ambush into a deadly trap. The consequences of defeat stretched far beyond the immediate battlefield. Japan's entire empire felt the shock. The fight had also revealed deep flaws in Japanese naval thinking. Admiral Nagumo, who had led the carrier group, now faced the disgrace of having mismanaged a pivotal engagement. The technical lessons were just as stark. American dive bombers had pierced Japan's defenses, while U.S. intelligence gave their commanders the upper hand. As Yamamoto surveyed the wreckage of what was once a grand strategy, he saw clearly that the war had entered a new chapter. The illusion of Japanese control over the Pacific had been shattered in a matter of minutes. The events of June 4th echoed across both nations like a massive shockwave, permanently changing the shape of the war. The shift in power was so significant that military leaders on both sides were forced to reassess everything. In many ways, the economic implications of the battle outweighed the fighting itself. The human loss extended far beyond the casualties at sea. Admiral Chester Nimitz understood the opportunity presented by this victory. The breakthrough in intelligence had proven more decisive than any weapon, and new tactics, born out of necessity at Midway, would shape how the rest of the war was fought. For Japan, Midway was the beginning of a long, painful retreat. For its commanders, it brought not just military defeat but personal ruin. And as the final smoke drifted away from the islands, the Pacific War entered a new, defining stage. Looking back, the Battle of Midway was far more than a clash of fleets. It was the moment the Pacific War pivoted. It exposed the limits of Japan's military doctrine, shattered the myth of its naval invincibility, and marked the beginning of a slow, relentless push by the United States toward victory. From a few coded messages intercepted at Station Hypo, to the desperate bravery of pilots flying into certain death, the tide turned because of countless small decisions, immense sacrifice, and a vision shaped not just by strength, but by insight. Midway teaches us that even in the darkest hours, clarity of thought, adaptability, and the courage to act can change the course of history. In just a few hours, on a remote stretch of ocean, the future of the Pacific was rewritten not by overwhelming numbers, but by those who understood where, when, and how to strike. This wasn't just a battle, it was a record.